Now the box of emotions is off the shelf, and I can still see her beat and bruised body, and there is nothing more convincing if anyone has doubts of my sister's death than to look at her autopsy and the crime scene photos. She looks exactly what happened to her, that she was brutally beaten and took about 3 hours to die. And yes, of course she died from bleeding out because her scalp was ripped open. That was the most ridiculous argument Mr. Rudolph could have made.
Real Crime Profile is made possible by many wonderful sponsors, from Madison Reed Hair Color to Stitch Fix Personal Shopping to Gobble Meal Delivery Service. So please, when you hear a special offer from one of our sponsors, do check it out and take advantage of it and show them your support for our show. You can also go to our website, realcrimeprofile.com, and see an up-to-date listing of the companies who help bring you Real Crime Profile and the limited time offers they have for our listeners. Remember, we can't do our show without you, and we certainly cannot do it without our sponsors. So thank you all for supporting Real Crime Profile.
And there certainly was a big strain going on in my mom and Michael's life around the time of her death.
What was that? Money, right?
I believe so. I mean, I was away at college, and I certainly think, parents would shelter their children from hard stressors in life. Anyone would do that. But there was definitely a tone of stress among my mom's company. Her stocks were failing. At one point, she called me devastated because she had to lay off her own boss that day. And I know that there was a lot of tension. Christmas was going to be, it was her favorite time of year, which is what, makes this such a hard time for us. But it was definitely going to be a little bit scaled back that year. You could tell there was some tension.
Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clemente, retired FBI profiler, former New York City prosecutor, and writer-producer on CBS's Criminal Minds. And with me from across the pond is...
Laura Richards, former criminal behavioural analyst at New Scotland Yard and founder of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service and author of the book Policing Domestic Violence and the Dash Risk Assessment Model.
And I'm Lisa Zambetti. I am the casting director for CBS's Criminal Minds.
Well, we are in the middle of discussing Michael Peterson's son, Todd, and an interview that he gave, or a particular event that he recounted, and we'll play that again.
My father had received a computer virus several months earlier. What the virus did is it took all the files on your desktop and it snatched them up and it would email to everybody on his email list. Everything. So this would include book chapters, photographs, software, and including these pictures you're talking about. I was over at the house one weekend, like usual, watching a football game, and on my way into the TV room, I'd heard a discussion inside the kitchen that sounded pretty interesting, and I kind of creeped up closer into the kitchen, listening in, and it was Kathleen talking to my father about the photographs on his computer, saying, "I want you to get them off. These possibly could have been sent out to our friends, to our neighbors, and I want you to get them off. If you ever get this again, I don't want this to have to be a concern of ours." So it was a full conversation, completely acknowledging the fact.
And what was Kathleen's attitude at that time? I mean, was it anger or?
No, it was not anger at all. It was more of get them off the computer.
So, guys, what do you think? I'll say I believe him. I believe the story. It's got spatial relationship. It's got this. It's got that. But tell me how I'm wrong. Go ahead.
Well, can you hang on, Lisa? Go back. When you say it's got this, it's got that, can you say exactly what you mean?
I just feel like, well, some of the things that you guys have talked about in other testimonies, he's very specific on the day, the time that he heard this, watching football. The context makes sense to me about why she would be afraid of this being the virus. Well, we know about these viruses, sending out our personal emails to the world accidentally or whatever. So that makes sense why she would be upset that he was looking at porn. Or whatever he was looking at, and his spatial relationships that he talks about, getting up and hearing this and being near the door, and obviously he's hearing this conversation out of context too. He doesn't know how it started, but and just watching his face, because I'm watching it as it's playing, I feel truthfulness. Now, I'm
Okay.
I should not be on any jury because I'm very, hypersensitive to everything.
All right, well, let me tell you why I disagree with some of that. I agree that he did say one day instead of on June 4th. He wasn't specific about the date. He said, I was there to watch TV like I usually did. Again, unspecific, but maybe weaving in facts that can be verified into a lie. The third thing he says, it's really creepy that he said, yeah, I heard this conversation. It was very interesting. So why is this interesting? What is interesting to him about this if it is not an anomaly? And the last thing I'll say is that Michael Peterson in the series specifically said he did not directly discuss it with Kathleen. He said she was aware of it, but, I don't think we ever had a direct discussion. So I just think that there's a number of reasons that contradict this, both internally in the statement that he's making and externally from Michael Peterson himself.
And it's certainly a convenient thing to remember this conversation. I think, the phrase pretty interesting stands out. You would probably want to say something more. I never thought my parents would have, images or something like that, be maybe surprised by it. But there are quite a few ers in there. And he does say there was a full conversation, which again is suitably vague, with her acknowledging the facts. And that she wasn't angry. So, I would want to question him more about that. But I felt he was suitably vague, and there wasn't specifics highlighted. And actually, Michael Peterson is questioned about this in episode 6 of Beyond Reasonable Doubt. And he says about whether Kathleen knew or not, and I quote him, "Yes, of course she knew. It just was not a major factor in our lives. There's love and there's sex. That's what that was. I was stunned. I thought all my children knew." So he thought all his children knew about his bisexuality. And we have to remember Kathleen was a very, traditional. She was on the Arts Council. She wanted a place in Paris. She was a very, what I can see of her victimology, conservative and traditional woman. So, I find Todd's account bizarre. And I also think that, from others talking about the relationship, that he didn't like Kathleen. And of course, we've got all these other question marks about his behavior, of him saying to Candice and Laurie that the paramedics were there when he got to the house, where in fact the paramedics say that he was there when they got to the house. So I question his testimony, along with the fact that he had also said that Kathleen on that night was drunk. And he also made a point of continuously saying that they were shit-faced, and that was his turn of phrase, that they were shit-faced, they regularly got shit-faced, and she probably just fell down the stairs. And why would you keep offering that up when something traumatic has gone on, and, saying something like that? Whose interest is that in?
Right. And I think you brought up also where he said she was not angry. But she just wanted him to get it off. But they're having this discussion loud enough for him to overhear. Obviously, he was further away when this started because he said he crept up to listen. And then he says she just wanted him to get it off. But it fights itself internally. It sounds like what he was saying, what he was describing, is an argument as opposed to a discussion, because clearly she's not happy that they're on there. And the fact that she could be embarrassed by this stuff being sent out to their family and friends is an indication that she's not accepting of it.
So one thing I want to go back to when he says pretty interesting, and watching his face and the way that he was couching that, it reminded me, just bear with me for a second. It reminded me of people who have a parent who they think are gay. and it's never been acknowledged, but you know it in your gut. Somehow you know it. And then you overhear your parents or people who you're not sure if they know it or not, but they're talking about it. And it's like, oh my God, there's a connection there. Like, I'm not crazy. This is true. And somebody else in my family knows about it. I know that's a long way to go, but that's where my mind went when he was saying that. That's the impression that I got.
Okay. So what's interesting about that, Lisa, if that's the case, why didn't he say that at all? Why didn't he say, this is the first I learned, or this is the first confirmation, or this is something that was totally shocking to me, or this is something that I was hoping was true? There's no comment about that. There's absolutely no response to a situation like that. If in fact you're a child, an adult child, how old was he at the time? 21?
I'm not sure.
Well, if you're the son of a man who you suspect to be gay, and then you find out that he's actually discussing photographs, I mean, if he actually knew, as a result of this conversation, that it had to do with homosexual photographs, then she would have had to have mentioned that fact in the discussion.
Uh-huh.
And yet he did not say that. He just said these photographs.
But maybe he's not the kind of person. This is a verboten topic. Maybe he's not the kind of person who's going to talk.
But if that is the case, then why wasn't there that kind of emotion that came out while he's discussing it? Or why weren't any details like that? Why wasn't there any judgment? Or why wasn't there any embarrassment? Or why wasn't there any other type of emotion conveyed during the course of him conveying this information? That is what's lacking. To me, you said there's all these indicators of veracity. What I'm saying is there's not, because there is no emotion attached to it. It sounds like a rote statement, and a very convenient statement, as Laura said earlier, that oh, I need to help my father prove that my dead mother actually knew about this stuff. Here's a very surface area way of trying to exonerate him.
And I know Laura's going to jump in a second, but Todd's affect in this interview is very much like his sister's, Margaret's affect, when she talks about the exact same thing, that her brother came to her and said, Dad's bisexual. And she was like, oh, but I knew that inside. We'd never talked about it, but I knew that. She didn't have a huge emotional reaction either when she's recounting it. I'm just
right, but she talked about the sexuality component of it. He did not, and that's what I'm talking
Laura?
about.
It's the absence. The absence. It's devoid of it.
Right. If he's the one that told her, then he's capable of talking about it, and yet he didn't talk about that in this interview. And the lack of it, as Laura said, is a red flag to me.
It is, and it's all just very convenient. Oh, and by the way, I remember this conversation. I was kind of creeping up on my parents. I remember them saying, and there was a computer virus, and so it's convenient. I have to say, I have red flags about Todd's behavior on numerous points. And so, this is just another point where his account is concerning in terms of veracity. So, but you're entitled to your view, Lisa. That's absolutely fine. You watched it and you're watching his face. I mean, it does seem a stretch to me, but you're entitled to understand it in the way that makes sense to you.
I don't know if it makes sense. I go back and forth so often in this frickin' case. The other thing that was brought up is Kathleen. This issue is, did she know? Didn't she know? And maybe she knew about the porn, that he enjoyed gay porn, and she didn't know about his actual in real life hookups, and that made her, freak out at him. I don't know. But this is not an unusual story to me of partners who are compartmentalizing their lives, and they don't think that they're cheating on the other person. They're doing things outside of the marriage. They love their partner, but they're doing these things outside the marriage. And the other partner may suspect it. They may suspect, but they don't ask, don't tell. And oh my God, yeah.
Lisa, But Lisa, that is fine, and that is true. It happens. You don't describe that situation as idyllic, perfect marriage. You don't describe that situation. If you describe it that way, you're lying. And so that undermines your credibility. And because he described it that way to begin with, and he even made the statement, if we ever argued, it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. He's trying to place a facade over this relationship that didn't exist. In fact, the man was cheating on his wife repeatedly and hid it from her. And then he tries to say she knew all about it. And I just don't believe that.
And it's the same with the debt issue. You know, Peterson's own email to others, including one to Patty, talking about the fact that Kathleen was under monumental stress with Nortel and her job, and how difficult she was finding everything. And Kathleen had said to Candice that she would stick it out at Nortel to the bitter end, but she thought she'd lose the job by the end of the year. Michael Peterson sends an email to Patty saying that he's very stressed about the money and about the boys, them having their loans and the financial situation. And we talked about that. But when he is questioned about it, he says, and it's a very kind of flippant account, they were living within their means. There were no debt issues. There were no problems. But that's a lie. So we know that he has lied. We know that he can lie. And so again here, by saying that Kathleen was aware, I have to say from her victimology, from what we know about her, from her traditional sense, from the fact that her husband in her first marriage cheated on her and it was a deal breaker, all of those things to me point to the fact that she did not know, and that evening, no doubt in my mind, that she found something and there was a confrontation of some sorts which led to her being found. And of course, there is a 2 hour and 30-minute window that is still unaccounted for in his own account, which changes a number of times about what was going on in those 2.5 hours. So there are red flags for me across his behavior and the fact that he has lied. Interesting fact, listeners. Did you know we spend almost a third of our life in bed? That's on average 9,125 days sleeping. And if you're like me, you want ultimate comfort and you want the sheets to look great too. And Brook Linen Sheets absolutely deliver on that. It's a husband and wife team who founded Brook Linen Sheets, and their mission was to bring 5-star hotel quality sheets to everyday life. My Brook Linen Sheets are the best, most comfortable sheets I've ever slept on. Brooklinen.com is giving an exclusive offer to our listeners. Get $20 off and free shipping when you use promo code REALCRIME at brooklinen.com. Brooklinen is so sure you'll love their new sheets that they offer a risk-free 60-night satisfaction guarantee and a lifetime warranty on all of their sheets and comforters. The only way to get $20 off and free shipping is to use promo code REALCRIME at brooklinen.com. That's BROOKLINEN.com, promo code REALCRIME. Brook Linen, these really are the best sheets ever.
One of the things you think about is, did he kill her? It's one of the first things you think about. And it didn't take me long when I heard about how he had handled himself at the scene that I was suspicious. But by no means did I know for sure what had happened. But as Art Holland, the Durham Police Department, said, and several other people said, as soon as they walked into the scene, they knew something wasn't right.
And I hate, that scene in the documentary where he's just bald-faced lying to Ron Durrett about being with Brad. That was just horrible.
Well, where he was testing the waters and seeing what Ron already knew, and what did he say?
That was.
I'm very surprised he would say something like that.
But look, don't you?
And that's why he's smart at what he does. He doesn't just plow straight in. He's thoughtful, he's intelligent, he's a writer, he's a storyteller. He's well educated, he's used to being in charge. And so, we don't see that side to him in the staircase. We see him as sort of, somebody who is taking a backseat to things and is forlorn at times. We don't see him as what I think is the true him, that taking control, command and control situations, of being the head of the table, of telling everybody how it's going to be, of withdrawing when he's not center of attention. We're only seeing a certain lens around him. So I think we do have to, understand that perspective. And if you listen to his interview with Beyond Reasonable Doubt, he only gave the interview. They appealed to his vanity and to his narcissism. And that's the reason why he gave the interview, because he was very anti to do it in the first place, because he can't control certain things. Well, so control is an issue for him.
Well, it is interesting, though, that the documentary does, that does make it into the cut, seeing him bald-faced lying. And Ron Durrett to me is such a fascinating person, because he knows he's lying. He knows that his client he's working for is lying, and he probably suspects that he's guilty, but he's...
Well, they're omissions. Let's be clear. They're lies of omission. Mm-hmm. It's what he's not saying, right? He's testing and he's waiting to see. And yes, I have no doubt, Ron's a smart, experienced... Yeah, and I agree with that. And there's no way an experienced law enforcement officer wouldn't miss those things. The gaps and the omissions and the pauses and the waiting to find out what he knows before he says anything. He's smart.
Yeah. One more question, one more comment I was going to make as you guys were talking about this. Do you know if David Rudolph, in his opening statements, did he actually say the word idyllic? Because I know he said soulmates and he said very positive things about the relationship. Of course, he's going to do that. He's not just, he's going to talk about the relationship. But this word is often, ascribed to him, idyllic. And I don't know if he ever said that. A lot of other people have said that the Petersons had fronted this idyllic marriage, but nobody sends you a Christmas card of everybody crying. Of course, we all present ourselves, and marriages are perfect in their imperfections, that, you have all your foibles and idiosyncrasies, but somebody loves you anyway. And so I just feel that that's a little bit unfair to say that, they were trying to front that they were this perfect family. Well, they weren't a perfect family. And I don't know if that's totally fair to think that they were trying. I mean, they clearly had a lot of...
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I wasn't talking about what a defense attorney said in an opening statement. I was talking about what Michael Peterson, the defendant, said, and how he described it, and the fact that his quote literally was, "If we ever argued," bringing up the question and making the implication that they never argued. If we ever argued, it would only have been for a few minutes. And so that, in and of itself, is a mischaracterization. And it is not true. And other people have described his anger and we've observed his behavior in that he is actually very cunning, manipulative. He's charismatic. It's very sanguine and sappy to me. His entire demeanor, his entire persona it really very much to me appears to be a cover that he has created, something to project outward about who this character is that he's created of himself. If Michael Peterson did kill Liz Ratliff in Germany, if he did kill Kathleen Peterson, then he's probably somewhere on the psychopathic scale. The ability to have done that is, like I said earlier, similar to Joseph Spangler, who killed 3 of his wives. And I think that the facade that he's created of his persona is literally just that. It's a very skin-deep attempt to mimic what he sees other people doing, what he sees as the community standard for behavior, when in fact, behind the scenes, he's setting up liaisons and having sex with male sex workers, and he's lying to his wife and kids about it. And that, to me, is a disingenuous, dishonest person, and I don't trust him.
Can we contextualize that for a second, Jim? When I think about it, here's a guy who's from the Deep South. He's in the military. He can't be out. He can't be his true self. I just take that a little bit in, when I think about somebody like him, Yeah, but you are superimposing that on him. He never said any of those words. He never said anything like that. In fact, he would have you believe that it was the most natural thing in the world,
that it was the most open, honest, straightforward thing that ever happened. That's why I don't believe him. You can't just say that because of the setting, because of the time, because of the circumstances, that he was going through this. He may not have had any care in the world about that, based on the way he actually presents it to us. And so I just find that not to be an issue in this case. I do understand it, but I don't think he did not convey that information.
So we're talking about his behavior and what we see, but perhaps we can step back and track back, I should say, to the autopsy, because there were some things that we didn't cover. And that's the autopsy of Kathleen Peterson. And then hopefully we'll be able to get to Germany as well, because obviously with Liz Ratliff's case, we have to remember there was no investigation at the time. So there was no investigation into her suspected death. But of course, there was with Kathleen Peterson, and there were, other people have theories as well around, what happened in terms of the forensic evidence. And I think there are two key things that stand out for me, which one is this footprint that's on Kathleen Peterson's, the back of her pants, which is down by the elastic cuff of her sweatpants. Which I would really like us to discuss. And I think it still just stands out for me as how did that get there? There has to, we have to think through different hypotheses for how that could be there. In the context that we've also got these 7 scalp lacerations, and those scalp lacerations are also seen in Liz Ratliff's case as well. We know that the injuries on the face, some of them were not from a flat surface, given the nose, the jaw, the brow protruding. And, we know that there were over 10,000 blood spatters. So it's a very bloody scene. And Dr. Radish says, as you earlier said, Jim, and I concur with this, is that death by falling down the stairs is a rare event, particularly with this amount of blood. And this 2-hour window that it's believed that Kathleen, may have taken her 2 hours to die. So where should we start? Should we start with the bloody footprint?
Sure.
So I sent you a picture, Jim and Lisa, of what was seen, this bloody footprint, and we mentioned it in another episode. And we've also talked about where she may be lying, etc. And it's difficult to say, whether she's been moved. But the fact that there is a trainer imprint in blood that's very clear on the back of her pants. Well, I did wonder whether it is possible, could he have, is there a world where he could have been straddling her? So on top of her, and therefore with your knees tucked underneath you and your feet behind you, is it a possibility that the back of his trainer, or the underside of his trainer, is on the back of her leg, and that's where that print comes from, as potentially he may be on top of her to keep her down, because we also know that there's blood on her feet too, and I want to come back to that.
Okay.
So,
well, I think you're right, Laura. I think that if he was kneeling on the ground and basically sitting on her, that his feet would be behind him, that the tops of his feet would be pointing down, and the bottoms of the soles of his shoes would be pointing up. And so if her legs had bent and she brought up her leg, it certainly could have contacted the bottom of his foot. And I think that's another reason why he may have taken off his shoes, because the tops of his shoes would have gotten very bloody. And it's very unusual, the lack of blood on his body. There's only a small area on his shorts, 2 or 3 stains on his shorts. And in a bizarre area of his shorts, which is like the underside of the crotch area, the leg area, the inside of the leg area. And that also is consistent with him being sort of squatting down above her, and especially she's the source of blood. So I do believe that that the scenario you paint is possible, and in fact probably pretty likely, because it doesn't seem like the way the blood pattern is on her, it doesn't look like she was actually facing downward. So this would be a good way to explain what actually happened. that she was laying on her back and that her knees bent, the back of the calf area on her sweatpants came in contact with the underside of his shoe because his shoe was basically facing up because he was kneeling on the ground.
I mean, that would make sense to me, and it just stands out, that shoe print. I've certainly not seen many cases where somebody's, in this situation, but, where there's a footprint on the person, but the person at the scene has taken their shoes and socks off. It's such an odd thing to do, and as you said, Jim, when we look at that print, it shows that he was wearing a trainer, a sneaker, as you might call it. And so it looked like from that particular shoe, there would be traction. It would be far better wearing shoes than not, if it's about it being slippery. But the other thing is she had defensive contusions on her wrists and hands. And so I do believe she was fighting back. And in that struggle, she may well have grabbed her own hair, which accounts for why there was hair in her hands. But noticeably, there appear to be no contusions on the rest of her body, like her ribs and her legs and feet and other limbs, which surely you would expect that if she fell down the stairs, as Peterson describes.
Did they ever find the shoes, by the way? I mean, did they find these shoes and check for blood on the tops of them, or do we know?
I believe his shoes were there. I mean, Art Holland says that when he walked in, it was a far cry from the scene that he expected. He expected he was attending an elderly lady who had fallen down the stairs, and it would be relatively simple in the sense of, what's gone on to process it. But seeing all the blood, seeing the towels, seeing the shoes, seeing his trainers there in amongst napkins and towels and all the blood, these were all his red flags. But of course, we know that not everything was processed. Her clothing, for example, wasn't processed. So, there are a lot of problems with the scene itself when you've got at least 7 people at that scene trampling through it, cross-contamination and all the problems that ensue when you haven't got control of a scene.
Right there in the top right-hand drawer to the desk is where these emails between Mr. Peterson and the male escort were. We believe that she found those inside of the desk that night.
And confronted Michael.
We believe that she confronted him and that he lost his temper at that point. We had established through a lot of people that knew them that he had a horrible, violent temper at times, and we believe that he lost it.
The pattern of the shoes shows that the raised part of the sole of the sneakers are very far apart and separated. That would have increased the traction. If he just had flat sole, completely smooth shoes, absolutely, it would have been very slippery. But your foot is flat and continuous, except for the ridge underneath where your toes start, basically. So that is actually more slippery than the shoes he was wearing, because those shoes are made to give you traction. And I find it very disingenuous that he is saying he had to take off his shoes because it was slippery. That just doesn't make any sense, not given the facts of what kind of shoes he was wearing.
Right. And I mean, how many scenes have you seen, Jim, where an individual takes off their shoes and socks at a bloody scene like this? Have you ever seen that before in your career?
For someone to take the time to do that when they're in the midst of this frantic, hopeful search for help? No. One, he goes upstairs to get towels. Why? She was wearing a sweatshirt, and he could have pulled that up and bunched it under her head if he wanted to give her support. He could have literally sat there and cradled her head and still been able to call 911. He didn't do any of that based on the blood spatter patterns on him. And so for him to take the time to go upstairs and get towels, leaving her alone on the floor, unconscious, barely breathing, to get towels, and then somehow getting his footprint on the underside of her sweatpants, and then walking back and forth when he's talking to the 911 operator, and then him taking his shoes and socks off. It makes absolutely no sense that he would spend that time and not be administering CPR. I think so. What he did do and what he failed to do, call out her name, try to rouse her, while he was on the phone with 911, plead for her to stay with him. Any of those kinds of things that we have heard over and over again, right, on 911 calls, Laura.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things are completely
And he
absent.
never mentions the blood,
And-
too. That's the weird. I mean, how does he know she fell? Like, if I came upon that scene with blood everywhere, I would think somebody had attacked her. So why, do you know what I mean? Like, why is he so sure that she fell and had those injuries when anybody else walking in is like, this is not a fall? So
Well, he did rationalize that. He was asked about that, and he said, well, anyone seeing your wife at the bottom of the stairs just logically concludes that she just fell down the stairs. That was his answer.
okay.
But I think the footprint, that is jarring to me, seeing that footprint on her leg. The fact that he doesn't administer CPR, the fact that he's not covered in blood, the fact that he washes his hands as well. I mean, Art Holland saw him washing his hands. So clearly he had blood on his hands, but the absence of blood anywhere else, when everybody else comments on it, you would expect him to have far more blood on him. And as we talked about, cradling her and, the concern for her, but taking your shoes and socks off, that jars to me. Why would anybody do that? It
Right.
makes no sense. And that 2.5 hour window where the blood has congealed, there is a time issue here of her dying across a, significant period of time. So she's 5'2", 120 pounds. She has got blood on the soles of her feet. So perhaps whatever happened, there was a struggle, and then he decides to straddle her. But these 7 lacerations are consistent with a flat object, of potentially her head being slammed against a flat object, which if it's slammed against a flat object, that could well be the wooden stairs. And I think this whole murder weapon thing is just a hocus pocus.
It's a red herring.
It is a real red herring of people looking for a cane and this blow poke, which is just absurd, quite frankly, when you see how flimsy they are. His
Right.
bare hands, the staircase are certainly much more likely. And if it's not a pre-planned, premeditated act, which I don't believe that it is, I believe it happened out of an altercation, a violent altercation took place because of a confrontation, then he wouldn't have gone looking for a blow poke or anything else, and it certainly wouldn't cause those injuries. And it's not just the injuries that she has; it's what's absent. It's the injuries you would also expect on the rest of her body that are absent. And of course, then you've got Liz Ratliff, who has some very similar injuries too. And suffice to say, I did want to mention, my partner did fall down the stairs 4 years ago. He fell from top to bottom. And when I got back, I'd been out training all day. He was still in the same position. He was conscious. We got him to hospital. There was no blood, but he did fracture his back. So, but that only came up later on with an X-ray that he had caused some serious damage. So, not always is there a huge amount of blood, but you can injure yourself different parts of your body. But there are clear areas of her body that is not injured, and there were no fractures to her skull. I mean, would you expect that, Jim, to be absent if her head was, slammed repeatedly against a wooden stair? It doesn't necessarily mean that there'd be fractures, but I would expect some fractures on her face or somewhere else.
Right. I think that a couple of things that you mentioned. I think you're right. I mean, it's the fact that it isn't a hard striking object that probably reduces the amount of the probability of fractures of the skull. But you said something about your partner, that he fell from top to bottom. Well, in this case, there's absolutely no question that she did not go anywhere near the top, that all the blood spatter was down at the bottom, that there was no impacts above the first 2 or 3 steps. Okay, this was a fall of a 5'2" woman who weighed 120 pounds, not a big strapping guy who went the entire length of the stairway. And so the amount of force that his fall from that height would have produced versus the amount of force that her natural fall from 3 or 4 steps up would have produced is just greater with your partner and much less with her. But it's clear that it had to have been repeated, and it had to have been repeated at the bottom of the staircase, and it had to have been repeated on the staircase because that's where all the blood spatter was. And this whole theory that the prosecution came up with about the blow poke, I mean, as soon as I heard that, I was just like, why are you even going there? That's such a mischaracterization of this evidence. I mean, I've reconstructed many hundreds of crime scenes, and I would never have gone there. And as I've said before, I agree with Dr. Lee, the falls, the head hitting the staircase, the flat surface of the treads and that landing area were most likely where those injuries were sustained. But I believe that she had help getting there, and I believe that she had help making those repeated contacts with that level of stairs. Had she fallen from the top and made multiple contacts with her head on the stairs as she was going down, the momentum of gravity pulling her down the steps and her tumbling and smacking the back of her head over and over again, then it could have produced that. But I don't believe that's possible down at the bottom of the stairs where she actually fell. I don't believe it's possible to have repeated hits, maybe 1 or 2 if she actually fell. But 7, I think she was assisted in that. I do not believe that was just accidental.
I want our listeners just quickly to note that Jim has just been critical of the prosecution, everybody. So just chill out about Jim being biased because he was a former prosecutor. Sorry.
I am very critical of prosecutors who do wrong things or make outrageous mistakes. And this prosecutor, we already talked about how I think they tried to use morality to sully the defendant's image, and I don't believe that has any place in the court of law. And they came up with a very flimsy theory about the blow poke, and it made absolutely no sense, and actually, in the end, hurt their case.
It really did hurt their case. It was distracting and irrelevant. And of course, we've also made clear points about how the whole scene was handled, which, there was an experienced detective, Art Holland, there, but unfortunately there was not control of the scene. And so we know that things were contaminated. We also know that things didn't get processed, which ordinarily they should have been. So perhaps that would have had a different outcome. And of course, with some of the individuals, Dwayne Deaver and others, there were huge problems around the forensics. So, Jim and I very much come from looking at the evidence and the behavior, and it's not taking one side or the other. We're just identifying where we have red flags and our professional insight of step by step of how we're trying to explain why we arrive at a certain determination.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to Real Crime Profile. Until next time, signing off.
If you like our podcasts, there are a few things you can do. You can take 2 minutes and go to Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review. You can also check out all Real Crime Profile offers and promotions and our sponsors in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go to Facebook and like our Facebook page, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Real Crime Profile without the E. And one last thing, please tell your friends, family and colleagues about us and spread the Real Crime Profile word. Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate all of our listeners.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan. Sound engineering by Mike Thal. Music is composed by Simba Tsumba. Logo art by Jim Clementi. Real Crime Profile is produced by XG Productions and distributed by Wondery.
For advice and support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0203 866 4107, or you can go to the website where there's a lot of information and advice that you can follow on www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic abuse, you can call the National Domestic Violence Helpline for free on 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, shelter or counselling, you can call Genesis, the 24-hour hotline, on 214-946-4357. You can also go to their website for further advice or support, www.genesisshelter.org. And there's the domestic violence hotline on 800 799 7233.